How do you differentiate between data and information?
Everyone's got their very settled definition based on theirs and everybody else is wrong. Everything's changing. But data used to be fundamental. Data is digital these days, generally, fundamentally by its nature, and at least used to involve numbers. It was stuff you could quantize. It was stuff you could calculate. To some extent, again, there are very strict definitions around it, but the concepts are fluffy and mingle a lot. Information was other stuff. I used to put it as documents. Or there's the classic line of, you start with the data, you use the data to generate information, you use the information to generate knowledge, you use the knowledge to generate wisdom and decision-making. So you can think of it as that as well. Data is the constituent bits, and then information is the wider context. The information management is its own kind of field of study as opposed to data management. I'm seeing a lot of nods here. There'll be people in the background go, oh, and then you get the knowledge management folk. It's huge. And now that we've got unstructured data through natural language processing and things, it's muddied the waters even more, right?
Welcome to the Smart Cities Council podcast and its special series with our global thought leaders. Smart Cities Council Global Thought Leadership Team is an exclusive group of subject matter experts driving policy and standards, setting industry trends, conducting research, and building and sharing knowledge to advance our mission. My name is Fanny Melesh. I am the Global Thought Leader for Youth Engagement at the Smart Cities Council, and today I welcome Aimee Whitcroft to the podcast, who is the Global Thought Leader for Data Ethics and Governance. Aimee Whitcroft is the founder and principal of data consultancy Data4D and chair of the Open Data Charter Advisory Board. She is passionate about and works in the intersections between data governance, ethics, privacy, futures thinking, and strategy. She mixes these with international advocacy for what she calls open X, open data, open government, civic tech, open access, open source, and so on. She's also very keen on plants and dogs. Aimee, welcome to the podcast.
Laura, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very glad to be here and very honored to be taking part in all of this wonderful work that y'all do.
And let's start with the easy question. What does data ethics and governance mean?
This is probably one of the more complicated questions. So people write PhDs and books and articles and entire websites around these topics. So I don't think I'm going to be able to cover it in a couple of minutes. But what it means for me, so we know that our societies are increasingly sort of data and information dependent. A lot of people say data and information enabled, and I've got lots of ethics rants, but I'd say that some of these technologies are not enabling, or they enable only a very small number of people and groups and disempower the rest of us. Anyway, separate rant, you'll probably hear that a lot during the interview because that's a separate rant. But data and of course information, but for our purposes here, data cuts through increasing amounts of what we do. And this means that we need to be making really clear-eyed, really intentional decisions about how we collect and store and use and share and archive and delete all of it. The data lifecycle type stuff that I'm sure many of the listeners will understand as key data management principles. And this is where data governance comes in. It's still really unusual in that I think data management is quite well understood by people. That's the operational day-to-day, what you do with your data, right? Data governance, which has been around for ages, don't get me wrong, and it's a heavily and very quickly shifting field now with Gen AI and so forth. But data governance is about taking that one step back in the same way that in organizations, management is the day-to-day operational and governance is the decision-making zoomed out layer. Data governance is much the same thing. So it's about deciding who gets to and I've got lots of definitions for it, but it's deciding what data can be collected, who can collect it, who can use it, how they can use it, for which purposes, who can share it, how they can share it, who controls, and then of course there's rules around managing its quality, its completeness, and deciding who owns that data if one ascribes to the notion of data ownership, and there's a lot of debate around that at the moment. So governance is about that. It's about making choices, about who makes the choices about data. And if you've got my kind of background, it's also making choices about who's in the room and being aware of who's not in the room in case they really should be in the room, but they've been excluded, either consciously or not. So that's basic data governance. It's zooming out and making choices about your data. Data ethics does what it says on the box a bit on that one. It is, it's about applying ethical lenses to your data and to how you govern and manage your data. And look, there is huge overlap between data governance and management. I should point that out. And so in some organizations, it is the same function. It's often it's a function of scale and maturity as to whether they're split out or not. I should go back and say that. So yes, data ethics is about applying ethical lenses. Now, there isn't one ethics out there. There isn't one ethical lens out there. So I do want to be clear about that. And yeah, this field and AI ethics as well, I'm sure many of our listeners will be all over that. It's a really big and really interesting field, and there is a tendency to try and come up with one framework for ethics or whatever that rules them all, and I would caution against that. But it's at least thinking about it, thinking about what the biases are, what the harms are, what are the privacy implications, all of that kind of stuff. So it's not just a compliance situation, because I think compliance is necessary but far from sufficient, and it depends on the regulatory maturity and situation of a country and a culture. But it's thinking about it. And it relates very strongly to situations around or conversations and paradigms and frameworks and thinking around data sovereignty, data justice, data equity, all of these kinds of things, which is saying it's not just about the data. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Data exists in a very human and indeed life-centered context. So let's really think intentionally about the effects of our increasingly data-centric societies. I have heard someone say, and I quite like it, dataism is the new religion. So it's just saying, let's step back, let's have a think, let's have a lot of conversation and make intentional choices. And that's what these things mean for me. They're huge topics all on their own.
Yeah, and I have so many follow-up questions, but we make sure that we fit into the time. And let's go first with something from the very beginning. You said that data and information. How do you differentiate between data and information?
This is one where whatever I say, I'm going to get yelled at by a whole group of people. I kid you not. It's also one of the big debates, the Venn diagram situations, very settled things, but everyone's got their very settled definition based on theirs and everybody else is wrong. I almost want to step back from this a little bit, but information has often in organizational contexts, at least been as records. It's stuff that data used to be, again, everything's changing, but data used to be fundamentally, data is digital these days, generally, fundamentally by its nature, and at least used to involve numbers. It was stuff you could quantize. It was stuff you could calculate. To some extent, again, there are very strict definitions around it, but the concepts are fluffy and mingle a lot. Information was other stuff. I used to put it as documents. Or there's the classic line of, you start with the data, you use the data to generate information, you use the information to generate knowledge, you use the knowledge to generate wisdom and decision-making. So you can think of it as that as well. Data is the constituent bits, and then information is the wider context. The information management is its own kind of field of study as opposed to data management. I'm seeing a lot of nods here. There'll be people in the background go, oh, and then you get the knowledge management folk. It's huge. And now that we've got unstructured data through natural language processing and things, it's muddied the waters even more, right? In fascinating ways. So yeah, that's why I said I don't really want to give a super strict definition. If anyone's really interested, go out, use your search engine of choice. You'll find at least 5 conflicting ones. It'll be awesome. But think of it as stuff that we know. So data governance, I mostly work at the data level, but at the information governance level as well, they all interact very strongly.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And I'm just glad that you were able to provide us this broader view on how it is not easy to differentiate between these, to understand what is one and what is the other, how they collaborate, how they mesh. So I'm glad that you were able to discuss that. Thank you so much. Now, another controversial question will be the next one. You mentioned when you were describing ethics that it's about, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that it's about understanding the biases and the bad actions and the bad consequences. Is ethics about, and yes, let's just talk about data ethics. Is data ethics only about deterring the bad things?
No, I don't believe so. And just trying to define ethics as its own field of study is, again, one of these vast fields of study, conversation, debate, straight up fights and grudge matches that go on for decades. It's awesome. But it's something I've been studying for decades now. It's great if you like that sort of thing. But thinking about data ethics specifically here, it's thinking about whereas governance is about making choices right about the data, data ethics, for me at least, is about deciding what's right to do and what's not right to do. And I realize sort of right and wrong is getting more about morals sometimes than ethics. But again, we're not going to get into that very gnarly conversation. It's just making what should we do and what shouldn't we do, right? Sometimes there are very hard red lines. I'm a big fan of those. There are things we absolutely will not do. And then it's fun watching major corporations absolutely betray that about 5 to 10 years later when they get big enough. There's rather big court cases going on around this at the moment. Without going into the detail, much as it's about data ethics and governance. And what absolutely should we do? And based on your society, the focus of your organization, it may be that ethically you have a fiduciary duty to maximize dividends for your shareholders. I'd say that's fiduciary, not ethical, but there's some interesting conversations around that. It could be that the ethical constructs that you align to and that your group of people, your community aligns to, says we want to maximize the good for the residents of our city. There are all kinds of ways to do it. So yes, I would say it's absolutely about what you shouldn't do. Let's minimize bias. That is a fairly classic one. Let's promote transparency, and in democratic nations, at least, let's promote democracy. Let's reduce inequality. These are quite classic concepts, and you'll notice a lot of them sound like sustainable development goal stuff. There's a strong relationship there, I think. So yes, it's countering the bad stuff, but there's huge, and yes, I'm doing the classic brain thing. It's fine. Science says it's all right. But there are huge benefits to doing stuff well as well. It's often set up as being ethical and behaving well is nice for your soul, but is terrible for your bottom line or whatever it is. And that's not the case at all. Behaving well it's great for your organization, your community, your society, the planet you happen to live on, which currently is having a bit of a tough moment because we've not been being ethical. But it can also become a unique value proposition, for example, in your industry. If people know you to be ethical, to really protect users' privacy, for example, to have really good InfoSec, cybersecurity, all of that stuff, you might find more and more users flocking to use your service or product. There you go. There's a really measurable upsides to behaving ethically, to behaving well. But again, what the details of that will differ hugely depending on your industry and your society and your cultures.
It would be awesome to go on a philosophical tangent, but we are here to discuss data ethics and governance for smart cities. For now, what is data ethics and governance for smart cities?
So again, if we go back to, and listeners will, I'm not going to explain what smart cities I share. I don't feel like it's necessary, and I'm fairly sure we're on similar pages at least. But one of the sort of key concepts, again, is that data runs through the concept of smart cities. Smart cities, or at least to my mind, aren't only about data or shouldn't only be about data and tech. There are a whole bunch of things that smart cities can be about that don't touch that. That's more about human structures and frameworks. But for our purposes here, data is, it runs through the idea of smart cities very strongly, which is cool. And I'll get onto the cool stuff shortly. But that comes with huge problems, potentially, right? If we were talking about ethics earlier, And just so there's the potential for, and we've seen it, capture by surveillance tech and by surveillance capitalism, indeed. And suddenly you're living in a surveillance society, and most people don't particularly want to. There are huge environmental costs to our increasing use of tech, both to run the data, to deal with the data, but also the tech that we use because the data is available to run our apps and our smartphones and all of that kind of stuff, and our smart cars, all of those kinds of things. And there are also other effects to people say, for example, AI of various sorts can really help with smart cities and stuff. But one has to remember that ADM, what I call it, algorithmic decision making, they can reinforce problematic behavior patterns in consumers or in other market players, right? And so much as the benefits are touted, a lot of the time we see in smart cities that data and its related effects, the positives are very much hyped, and any potential negatives are either not at all or not spoken about because it's a little awkward. It's complex to consider. It's very difficult to sell that in when people are producing the stuff. I realize that I sound a little cynical and skeptical about some of this. I'm also really excited about like the good stuff. And you get like really there have been so many high profile failures of smart city stuff where they did silly things with data. I think that we can all think of Sidewalk Toronto being a really famous example that gets spoken of still all these years later. And it was such a perfect tick box example of what can happen if you don't think this stuff through. We have to remember that cities aren't actually computers and people aren't actually data. Beware the analogies, because analogies shape how we think of things. So, given all of my data governance, I believe, is absolutely key to making sure that smart cities are successful with their data and related technology use. So it'll help avoid it'll help to avoid the deleterious effects that I mentioned, and that's by far not a comprehensive list. That's a brief summary of some of them. But where it gets really exciting is that data governance is fundamentally an enabling paradigm. People think that it's a compliance, this is the no brigade, they're just going to say no to everything, like information security. And it's incredibly the opposite thing. It's fundamentally enabling because it means that you're doing the right stuff in the right way. So you can be not only efficient, which is all about doing something very well, or maybe using minimal resources to do something, but you want to be effective, right? You're doing the right thing rather than doing the wrong thing very well. And again, what that is, depends on the situation. But the OECD has put it as, and let me pull up the direct quotation here, there are no smart cities without comprehensive and agile data governance arrangements. And that's because data governance will enable, as I said, effective data use so cities can make better and faster decisions. It'll help to set the course for sort of policy decisions and power structures in cities, of course, because who has access to and can use data? Yeah, there are huge power structures involved in that, enabling and disempowering and everything in between, right? You'll see these fights really start to heat up in the coming years, including between private sector and public sector and NGOs, and who has access and who doesn't, and who's paying and who isn't, and all of that kind of stuff. I mentioned the SDGs earlier, so I won't go into that again, but more and more smart cities are, of course, thinking about what a sustainable and resilient smart city looks like. It's one of the benefits of smart cities, right, that people talk about is we can do all this better as things get worse, basically. So, it also means that we can make better choices, not only for our communities, but for our wider situation. So the life that we live with, when I talk about life-centered, human-centered hasn't gone very well so far, but if we think life-centered, our ecologies, then we can start to make really useful decisions. And again, data governance is going to be absolutely key there. Now, what we're going to have to think about, and ethics for me will always be interwoven and underwoven and overwoven and throughwoven. But if we want to do this really well, So Open North, for example, has coined the term open smart cities. I suggest people go and look at that if they haven't already come across that. It's a great concept, saying it's not just smart cities isn't just about the tech, right? It's about the life. Tech is an enabler potentially for it, but it's about the life. And now I've lost my train of thought. Anyway, but if we get it right, so if cities come together and make these choices for what works for the city as well, this is hyperlocal stuff, right? What works for Cape Town in South Africa is unlikely to work for Wellington in New Zealand, right? It's very unlikely. So make these choices, but if you do it ethically and thinking about sovereignty and equity and justice and whatnot, then what you can do is make sure that data benefits the entire city as a whole. And that, I believe, is how you make sustainable and resilient cities. Yeah. So that got a bit muddled because I got so excited. Everything all happened in my head at the same time. The thing to keep remembering is there is no one ideal model. And again, I'll reiterate it over and over again. There is no one framework. There is no one model. And there is no one technology. So again, I would suggest to cities and to anybody else, be very aware, be very wary of somebody who comes in who says, I can sort out your data governance needs with a platform, with a product. Because data governance is fundamentally about decision-making at human levels. Products are phenomenal for helping to manage the data, but the governance is fundamentally a human activity because it's about governance, and data governance it's strongly about collaborating. You've got to bring in stakeholders from across the organization, from outside the organization, all of that kind of stuff to come together to make good decisions. If you want it to work well, it can also fail abysmally and be an expensive exercise in heartbreak. But if you want it to work well, so there's that intentionality once again of stopping, sitting back, having lots of corridor, lots of conversation with people. There will be complicated conversations. There will be people with different priorities and sometimes competing ones, making those decisions. And then that's how you get to an incredibly enabling situation, right? It also, in that effectiveness, will help organizations, cities, groups of people. So you've got better decision-making through AI, through human stuff, through all of that. And that could be around in smart cities. That's around water, that's around waste, that's around energy, that's around traffic, that's around construction, you name it. You can start to make better decisions because your data is being properly governed and therefore better managed. So it's higher quality, all of that kind of stuff. You're going to save a whole bunch of money because our propensity for holding heaps of data is very expensive. That data is stored. That does come at a cost. Ditto analysis. You potentially going to save a whole bunch of money on analysis because you're not having to also clean it all up, do all of that work around it. You are much safer with that data because when you get hacked, it's always a win. It's not an error. You won't be holding data that you shouldn't have been holding and not going to get spanked for having had. Plus these huge effects. Bernie's laughing in the background, but seriously. But there are also the very serious harms that can happen with data breaches to the people whose data that was. So all of this, can you see like data governance suddenly gets very exciting. It's protecting you from harms, but you can start to do really cool stuff with it because it's good. Or if it's not good, at least it's not, and you can put in place appropriate mitigations or whatever around that. Anyway, so yeah, where I'd suggest that cities start is some key principles. There is cool writing around this kind of stuff. People like me, there's heaps of us out there who can help. But having some core principles, I think, is always good around data governance. So the decisions that places might want to start making, for example, is deciding how sovereignty will work at the individual and public level in terms of data sovereignty, and group level as well. Indigenous data sovereignty is a big deal for some of us and should be an even bigger deal for all of us. Who will steward the data? Other examples are how transparent will the data and its life cycle and things like that be? To what extent will it be shared? Open, closed, proprietary, not? How much or little of it will people collect and use in the first instance? Because there are enormous environmental effects to our use of data, and sociocultural and socioeconomic, and a lot of them are incredibly negative. So It's really thinking through all of that. And if cities can, and I think smart cities, it would be cool if cities were really smart, right? If they were able to sit down and start thinking about this kind of stuff. And you don't have to make all of these decisions all at once, right? But have a starting situation, start those conversations, come up with something quite simple. I'm a fan of quite simple things. See how it works, iterate, optimize, iterate, optimize. As the maturity grows, you can start to make these things more complicated as your residents gain data literacy so they can be involved in these discussions, because I think that's ideal. And unless you don't want them involved in discussions for less ethical reasons, but you can start to really wind this out. And those give you, if your data is starting to be well governed and well managed and ethically, ideally, this gives you the underpinnings to start to do, as I said, that really cool AI stuff. And a good underpinning for that is then starting to have an AI charter for your city, for example. Again, I'm a fan of principle-led, saying these are the things we want to do, these are the things we will do, this is how we will make these kinds of decisions, and with whom, and in what ways. Does that make sense? This is it's a network of associated fields of study and frameworks and thoughts and paradigms, but there's also quite a strong through line here in terms of maturity. And there are people doing cool stuff. The EU's been working in this for ages, of course. The OECD's been doing some stuff. Ireland's working on a national, like country level data governance framework for the country, because you can do that. There's cool stuff going on.
And I love how your enthusiasm just shines through all of this. And while I would love to understand the specific challenges and opportunities you would highlight, you were already touching upon those in your answer. So instead, I would love to understand, how did you arrive to this topic, this field? What has been your journey?
Yeah, I've had a very, I don't know that meandering is the right term, but because there are some strong throughs. I'm a network-based being, right? Not a linear hierarchical-based being. It's not how I think. It's not how I live. But I've always been interested in ethics and related kinds of topics. I studied at university, but before that, I was thinking about it from very young. And I've kept studying and reading things about it because I think it's fascinating, as philosophy tends to be, especially when you pull in things like cognitive neuroscience. And it's all about how we think and why we think the way we do, and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's an innate sense of justice or something. I'm easily horrified by terrible things, to put it another. I cry easily in films. And I've always been, in my working life, pretty much always, especially the last couple of decades, really motivated by social impact and social effect, and especially positive social impact and social effect. So as a result, I spent years working in the public service here in Aotearoa. But I've also been working in and around science, and then moving more into sort of tech and data stuff for now years and years, often coming from initially an open data, open government front, initially as a civilian advocate, and then working more formally in it within the wheels of government. But I've also been involved with startups. And so I've been around all of these kinds of areas for a very long time, and watching the various trends as they come through. And these days, for me, being increasingly angry by what's happening in tech and data, I'm increasingly livid about the situation, because I find it so unethical and so damaging and so harmful on a planet that's dying because humans can't sort out the polycrises they're causing, that a lot of this stuff is actively worsening, like on a daily basis, while being incredibly exciting. I didn't get to talk about all the cool stuff, but we can do that another time in terms of these technologies. So seeing all of that and going, how can I be involved? I can be angry and do nothing about it. And I've said for decades, if you're angry, do something about it. Or if you're sad, and do something about it. Or sit on the sidelines, but then nothing can change. So this stuff fascinates me. I've got a background in all of these things. I've worked in these areas for years, for decades in some cases. And I feel strongly that data governance is this slightly forgotten, not really known about. There are some major challenges as to why this is the case, but not really known about field that absolutely underpins all of this, including AI governance and ethics, or a lot of it. So if I'm looking for a fulcrum if I'm looking for strings on which to pull to try and have or try and help push for positive effect, even if I can only make a tiny bit. Data governance and data ethics and sovereignty and justice and rights and all of these things feels to me like one that just fits really naturally and feels like one to me that where one can really have an impact. If we all think about it, there are awesome impacts we could have rather than unthinkingly strolling into a techno-determinist future, which I'd prefer we didn't do. I know that there are people who would prefer that we did, but they're much richer than I. And I'm really fond of living things. So yeah, it's quite meandering, but it always comes back to that sort of trying to do the right thing in the right way again, right?
I loved your description that I could be just angry and not do anything, or I could be involved. There is a famous saying, I think from the Asian culture somewhere, that if you don't like it, change it. You are not a tree. So I completely agree with this. I did with that. Yes, we can change it. We can create better future for ourselves. Aimee, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I would love to ask you for hours, but you have some stuff to attend to, and I do also. So, as a last question, do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I do. For anyone starting out or interested in this field and like how you get involved in it, there are heaps of certifications and trainings and things you can do should you want. Read, talk to people, talk to anybody you can, reach out to anybody who talks about this stuff, but don't confine yourself only to data governance per se. Be a multidisciplinarian. Think about the world around you. Think about how all of these things interact. I wrote a paper on climate data governance last year with a colleague, and I think it was like the first in the world that had been written. Nobody had put the ideas of climate data and data governance together quite that way. There's a heap of scope to be doing something awesome. And in your organizations, in your communities, in your groups, in your home, with your whānau, with your people. And reach out to me or reach out to anybody, of course, please. But do feel free to reach out to me. I'm super available and I love helping people with this kind of stuff. And I know everyone's busy and capability and capacity are a major issue, especially with this. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me if I can help or you've got any questions or just want to chat about this kind of stuff. That's my dog barking. Sorry, she's joined in today as well. But yes, that would be my ask. And just, zoom back, think about what it is you're doing with the data around you, and please make intentional choices.
And we just heard from the bio that you are fond of plants and dogs, so it's all good that she joined. Now, thank you so much, Aimee.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
If you want to learn more about Aimee, links will be provided in the show notes, and the Smart Cities Council website can inform you even more. What have you learned from this interview? What questions do you have after listening to Aimee? What would you like to know more about? Let us know on the Smart Cities Council website or on LinkedIn. Look out for other episodes with the global thought leaders or topical discussions. And thanks for tuning in.